Joining us now is someone who has made international headlines with a report on what has really taken place between the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Joining us is Justice Muralidhar. Justice Muralidhar, as somebody who has participated in the UN exercise to establish an independent investigation into what has happened, before I get into the specifics of your report and the findings, can you take us through the methodology, how you went about preparing the report, and what were the sources that you relied on?
So before we launch on a topic for a report, we issue what is called a public call for submissions. Anyone, anywhere in the world, if they have information relevant to the theme of our report, can submit it to us online. Then we have multiple sources. We have open sources which are available on the net, but most importantly, there are victims and witnesses who are prepared to speak to us, having come out of the Palestinian territory to the neighboring countries. So we also conduct remote interviews. We've interviewed children themselves. We observe all the protocols. Then we have treating doctors. We've interviewed journalists. We've interviewed lawyers. So there are testimonies, and many of them are first-hand eyewitness testimonies. Then we have video clips, audio clips, photographs, but these we subject to very strict scrutiny. We use forensic scientific analysis. We do metadata extraction. We make sure that even when the public call for submissions is issued and we get responses, that many of them are genuine, authentic sources. So, because one of the criticisms is, we could be relying on evidence given to us by Hamas or something like that. We have enough screening mechanisms to make sure that does not happen. Then, of course, for this report, we were benefited by the numerous videos, clips, photographs taken by Israeli soldiers themselves and posted on social media. So, although it could be seen as a handicap that we've not been able to enter the area because Israel refuses us permission to do that or speak to its citizens or its soldiers, when we have the soldiers themselves speaking not just to us but to the whole world, it certainly helped in arriving at some of the conclusions in the report.
Right. Because you just mentioned you've taken a lot of things from social media, but social media itself is replete with manipulated, fake, AI-generated.
We have forensic experts. We have a cybercrime expert. We have people who do rigorous forensic analysis. We make sure that we don't rely on fake videos, morphed videos. That's the first thing we do. Otherwise, it's replete with all kinds of information, much of it which is not genuine. So we take extra pains to make sure that. So I must also say this, we align our evidence gathering protocols and analysis protocols with that of the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court, which is a very, very rigorous standard. So every finding that has been returned is backed up by solid evidence, which screens the evidence that you're mentioning and is fully aware of that danger, that we should not be relying on just social media posts. For that matter, we don't rely only on news reports. There are so many news reports one could simply rely on, but this team insists that there must be independent, verifiable sources.
Right. One of the strongest conclusions that your report draws in is that you refer to genocidal intent, something that Israel itself denies. How do you arrive at a conclusion such as this? Because this is very, very sort of serious in terms of being a charge, a grave charge.
It's an extremely grave charge because genocide has more than one element of just killing. It has 6 different elements. In fact, in international criminal law, there is what is called war crimes, there's crimes against humanity, and there's genocide, and each of it has definitions. And they're very complicated. One of the elements for genocide is preventing of childbirths of a group, so that there's no continuity of that group. So this is just one of the elements. This commission gave a detailed report on genocide in September of 2025. And this report is in furtherance of that. That is, it will establish one more element of the genocide, which is that children are being specifically targeted. Children are not being allowed to be born because you have a large number of stillbirths of children, because reproductive care is being affected very badly by Israel's hostilities. But also the existing children are being specifically targeted. So that one key element of genocide appears to be established from what we have found. And our standard is reasonable basis on the basis of the evidence. It's not beyond reasonable doubt. Since we are an investigating body, we are not required at this stage to establish something beyond reasonable doubt. Our evidence will be tested by a judicial body. They can find further facts. They can subject to people who have spoken to us to cross-examination. So they could arrive at a conclusion which, for instance, in a particular instance, says that this is crimes against humanity, maybe it's not genocide. But when we look at the entire picture, we look at our earlier report, we'll look at the report on non-state actors. When we look at this report, if you read it all together, a clear picture emerges that various elements of genocide which shows intent to not allow the Palestinian group to continue stands established.
But for genocide to be established, it would have to be a systematic thing that is happening over a period of time, that is done with a certain intention.
Correct.
Were you able to establish that? Because the criticism might come out that
Yes.
this is something that happens in battlefields, particularly in urban centers such as these. So how are you able to bring out the fact that this is happening in a systematic manner?
So genocide, interestingly, can happen even when there are no hostilities. In fact, that's one of the peculiar features of genocide, that it continues over a period of time. And this commission is tasked with looking at root causes as well. So it can go back to 1947, it can go back to the Nakbas, it can go back in time. And here we are looking at a time period between 7th October 2023 and 2 years till 7th October 2025, but even beyond. This commission has looked at till the end of March 2026, and it finds there is a pattern, or a pattern of 2 years. And children are being killed not when they're indulged in any hostilities. Children have been killed when they're playing outside the tent, when they're collecting some firewood, when they're running to collect food, The 8 packets are thrown and children are, running helter-skelter to just pick up whatever they can. They're being shot in those kind of situations. A 10-day-old baby is being shot while being breastfed. So these are not justifiable as killings that happen incidental to hostilities. So this is what tells us that there is a deliberate intent.
Right. Israel has come out and called this entire report as a quote-unquote libelous, sham and defamatory. How do you respond to Israel?
Yeah, we are aware of this. See, we're a bit surprised, I must say, because as a chair of this commission, I myself have written formal letters to the permanent mission for Israel in the UN, asking to engage with us, asking that we meet them, asking them to share whatever information they have with them, and of course asking for permission to visit the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. There is no response to any of that. And then 2 weeks before we finalized this report, we sent a copy to the permanent mission for Israel. Again, no response. So it was almost as if they were waiting for the report to be published to then mount a criticism. But we've studied that 18-page rebuttal rather carefully. We don't find any evidence being presented which can contradict the evidence painstakingly gathered by the team, which forms the basis for our report. We're still open, and I would like to repeat what I've said earlier. We're still open to receiving any material, any evidence that Israel may have, which it thinks we should have looked at, which it thinks contradicts our findings. We are willing to look at that evidence and we'll analyze it with the same rigor with which we've analyzed the evidence. And I've said this earlier also. You see, there is a 3-member commission. We have one, Mr. Chris Sidoti, who's a very senior lawyer who's had a vast experience in the UN system. We have Justice Florence Mumba, former judge of the Supreme Court of Zambia. And then I come from India with more than 4 decades of experience with the law. There's absolutely nothing to be gained by either of any of us to falsely accuse either the state of Israel or its soldiers or the settlers who are Israeli citizens of committing such heinous crimes. So we do it with a lot of deliberation, with a lot of awareness that our findings should be backed by solid evidence. And still, if Israel thinks, okay, there is something that contradicts this, let them present it, not just to us, but to the whole world. And we should be able to look at it as objectively as we looked at every other evidence.
Right. But are you confident? What happens from here on, of course, is a big question. Are you confident that this will lead to some kind of action? Does this go before the ICJ? How does this proceed from here on? Because in the past, there has been a lot of criticism of the UN system that, effectively speaking, sometimes these reports don't really end up in any kind of consequence for those parties who are carrying out such acts as are being alleged. What is your hope and how do you see things panning out?
No, I'm sure you are aware and the viewers are aware that South Africa has brought a case against Israel before the International Court of Justice. Many of us were fortunate to watch those proceedings live because they were live streamed, and some very powerful arguments were made. The work of this commission has contributed to those proceedings. We were asked to share the evidence we've gathered, which we have. Like I said, since our evidence gathering protocols are aligned with that of the ICJ, it's easier for those judicial bodies to deal with it. Likewise, before the ICC, there are proceedings. Warrants have been issued against Mr. Netanyahu and other officials in Israel. It's a different matter that without the active cooperation of countries, the provisional orders passed by the ICJ cannot be strictly implemented. But that does not mean that nothing is happening. The third thing that is happening, and which will be interesting for you to know, is that domestic courts are being approached for initiating proceedings against members of the Israeli Defense Forces who participated in these acts of genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Those domestic courts, some of them, are exercising what in international law is known as universal jurisdiction. To give you an example, let's say that England or France finds within its territory one of the members of the Israeli Defense Forces who could be either an Israeli or could be a dual national, because we have American citizens serving on the IDF, we have UK nationals, French nationals, Australian nationals. They are going back home, or an Israeli soldier is vacationing there. There is an obligation on these countries who are member parties to these conventions to investigate the role of such persons in these crimes, and if they find that some prima facie case is established, so send them up for trial in their domestic courts. And that is already happening. These are not the, I mean, I gave examples. There are some countries which I don't want to disclose for want of, preserving the confidentiality, but that process is underway. So we are asked to share evidence, and we are prepared to share the evidence we've gathered. Those courts will take it further. And I want to emphasize, we are an investigating body. We are not a judicial body. We have not pronounced a final verdict. So those courts will use the evidence that we've gathered against these individuals and find out their precise role and then proceed further in accordance with law.
Right. You also said, I want to quote you, that India exports small arms to Israel, and you urged that, supplying weapons and the policy around these should be reconsidered because the supplying country cannot escape the charge of aiding and abetting war crimes. Given India's strategic partnership with Israel, and Israel has also, for instance, helped India in times of crisis such as the Kargil war, what would you suggest would be the pragmatic route out?
Yeah, we can't turn a blind eye to the complete brazen violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. See, we are all part of the larger group of United Nations. We are vitally interested, India is vitally interested in the effective working of these mechanisms. While it's definitely important to have trade relations and strategic relationships with different countries, if we do not support the call for effective enforcement of international humanitarian law and human rights law, then we are ourselves, by our actions, weakening the system, which is not in our interest. Like, when Kulbhushan Jadhav was wrongly apprehended and denied a fair trial in Pakistan, we did approach the International Court of Justice. So these mechanisms are something that we want to engage with. And we have got favorable orders in the past. And these mechanisms are what gives us hopes against countries that can be powerful and, try and get away with brazen violations of human rights law. The whole mechanisms, these, whether it's International Court of Justice or International Criminal Court, are to deal with this concept of what is called impunity, that you commit crimes and then there is no capacity either by the country where the crime is being committed or by other countries to prosecute you. And if this is allowed to continue, then it will result in a breakdown of that international legal order, and we don't want that happening.
Right. When you talk about human rights, of course, they are constitutionally mandated. We have the Human Rights Commission, etc. But one of the counter arguments that comes up is that what about the human rights of those who have suffered at the hands of the terrorists, who are carrying out various terrorist attacks? So in that light, I'd like to ask you, would there be a similar UN investigation into the October 7th attacks by the role of Hamas and their role in terms of carrying out and perpetrating that kind of mass violence?
I'm glad you asked this question. So when the October 7th incident happened, this commission was engaged in working on a report to submit to the Human Rights Council, and it halted that work and immediately took up the October 7th incident. So there's a very detailed report submitted by this very commission on the October 7th incident, which has listed out all the atrocities committed by Hamas. This is something that people are not aware of. It is already there in the public domain. They can go and see it. So Hamas's actions have been listed out. All its violations, its acts have been listed out in that report. Likewise, in a report we submitted on 15th June 2026 again to the Human Rights Council, that is this year, that report is on non-state actors. We've talked of the violence by Israeli citizens who are settlers, so forcibly occupying Palestinian lands, burning their fields and burning their houses, killing the people. But we've also listed out the atrocities committed by Hamas and its affiliated organizations within Palestine. People are again not aware. Hamas is, just falsely accusing people, the Palestinians, of collaborating with Israel. It's carrying out public executions. It's making children witness this. And for very small theft, those kinds of crimes, it's awarding disproportionate punishments. It's also treating children very cruelly. And we've listed out this in that June report. So it's not as if, we're not concerned about the victims. We're concerned about all victims, whether they're Israelis, Palestinians, or others. You're absolutely right. Justice must be done to the victims of all terrorist acts, whoever may be committing it.
But what kind of action can be taken against groups such as Hamas under the aegis of the United Nations and the similar mechanisms?
So the same. So whether it's the International Criminal Court or other domestic courts in countries, let's say some Hamas fighter is found in another country, that country has an obligation, if it's a treaty party, to investigate the role of that person, initiate the criminal processes against such person. So it can be any of them.
Right.
None of them should be allowed to enjoy impunity. That's the whole purpose of setting up the international legal order, because there can be safe havens found by these people in other countries. You have them being, and it's a very painful process of extraditing a criminal found in another territory to the territory where he should be tried, which is why you have bodies like the International Criminal Court. Earlier, they had to set up ad hoc tribunals. You have the ad hoc tribunal for Yugoslavia, you have for Rwanda, which is why the thinking among the nations was, instead of having ad hoc tribunals, let us have one International Criminal Court.
Correct.
Where all of them can be tried.
Correct.
So that can happen, definitely happen.
Correct. I'd like to come back, of course, here to India, because you have said that we want international law when it comes to Wall Street rankings for maritime trade, but the moment it comes to international human rights law, politicians claim it's foreign to our traditions. So what reforms do you think are required to ensure that there is a uniform approach towards human rights?
More than reforms, actually our domestic law is more or less aligned with the international human rights law. We have a very progressive provisions, and the way our Supreme Court has interpreted the Part 3 of our Constitution. So we don't have to take much to say, let's comply with all the international human rights law mechanisms. Like we have ratified the Child Rights Convention. We've ratified the CEDAW Convention. So in terms of what needs to be done with the law, yes, maybe we should have a specific definition of what constitutes crimes against humanity, what constitutes genocide. But that shouldn't pose any difficulty for us to make sure that all human rights violations are tackled and nobody is allowed to enjoy impunity. So that we just have to get our act together on it.
Right. I must also ask you about the huge controversy surrounding the film Satluj, which documents, excesses by police, the killing of an activist, so on and so forth. What do you make of this entire controversy? Because the criticism is that the film is only one-sided. It only talks about this individual, but not of his origin, and about the Khalistan perpetrated terror that Punjab earlier suffered from in the years in the run-up to these incidents which are documented.
Actually, I was expecting to see the film, but within 2 days, I think it was taken off. So I have not had an opportunity to see the film. See, documentation of all these excesses of state action is very difficult to come by. And it's a painstaking task and it's undertaken at great risk. So I know that we have a category of such persons who are called human rights defenders, internationally recognized. And it's because the states are not forthcoming with proper information that they have to undertake this task. So we have to understand it from that perspective also. The sooner we actually deal with complaints of human rights excesses and in a transparent way, the better it is for all states, which is why we have our human rights bodies. The National Human Rights Commissions, the State Human Rights Commissions, were tasked with actually dealing with all of this. When these mechanisms do not satisfactorily deal with it and in good time, because we are looking at violations that occurred in the 90s, and you've not had any concrete action being taken. See, you can prosecute, you can acquit, but if you fail to prosecute, then it leaves a brooding sense of injustice. So that is something that we have to pay attention to. These are instances of what are called mass crimes. They're in very trying times. There's no difficulty at all, because those were a decade where Punjab witnessed horrific crimes on all sides, and everybody wants to know what was the truth. So we activate, if we are able to activate all those mechanisms that can uncover the truth and give us, do it in a transparent way that infuses confidence of the people that our systems are working and that our systems of accountability will deliver justice, then there will be no doubts, no controversies. It will only reinforce faith in our system. So that is probably what we need to do.
Right. The concern also arises because India has suffered from terror. We've lost
Correct.
prime ministers, we've lost chief ministers.
Correct.
But,
Correct.
so, as a nation, should we, have a resolve? We've also brought in stronger laws, over the past few decades to
Correct.
deal with terror.
Correct.
So, in a situation like this, can we afford to be, say, one-sided or partial when documenting such evidence, such instances?
No,
That's the question.
You've answered the question. This is what we call a rhetorical question. I can't obviously agree with you that evidence gathering can be one-sided. Of course it can't be one-sided. It has to be from all sources, and we have to have a way of using objective standards to evaluate the evidence. It can't be one-sided. Definitely not. And we have to have all versions. That's why a court of law is important, right? You get the prosecution's version, you get the defense version, and you have an assessment using objective standards. So that is essential in any system, which is why these international mechanisms have grown up. See, they came about because there are several countries in the world where rule of law completely breaks down. There are several African countries, Latin American countries, and we have what is called transitional justice. There is a regime change, and then how do you deal with mass violations? Like South Africa went through that phase. They had to use the method of truth and reconciliation, because they knew they could not do complete justice. It will take years on end for even acknowledging crimes have happened, the crimes of apartheid, for instance, that have happened for several decades. So they had to devise their own mechanisms at arriving at the truth and doing justice to victims in an effective way. So each country has to find a way of doing it, but there are several countries which are left with no means. That is why they came together and said, let's have an international criminal court. That's why they have the International Court of Justice. These mechanisms are to assure world's peoples that there will be some forum where all the grievances can be addressed in as objective a manner and as fair and neutral in a manner. So those standards, I think, if the domestic courts adopt from the first court to the last in the hierarchy, then the faith of the people in the system will improve, and there will be no reason then for misgivings and apprehensions.
Justice Muralidhar, thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us.
Thank you. Thank you.